Welcome to the Vandy Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Our guest today, Chris Clark of Gamecock Central. We will talk about South Carolina, one of the opponents on Vanderbilt's football schedule this season. Today's show is sponsored by the Well Coffee House, which turns coffee into water. The Well is a coffee house with a mission to bring clean water to the world. To date, over 30 communities across the globe now have access to safe water, health, and hope. You too can make an impact by visiting a Well Coffee House location today. There are 5 locations to serve you in the Nashville area: Brentwood, Green Hills, downtown, Bellevue, and the Cool Springs Lifeway. More information can be found at wellcoffeehouse.org, the Well Coffee House, where coffee changes lives. We also thank our co-sponsor, Wellspire, Nashville's Learning and Development Center, which is located in the Gulch. Our news presented by Sutherland & Belk, a local injury law firm committed to helping those who've been injured in accidents. You or someone you know has been in a wreck or other accident, reach out to Sutherland & Belk and see what your rights are. You can find their contact info online at sbinjurylaw.com. Tight end Jared Pinkney has been nominated for the Walter Camp Award. He is one of just 40 nominees for that award and one of just 2 tight ends. That is given annually to the best college football player. So congratulations to Jared Pinkney for being nominated for that prestigious award. Our guest line is brought to you by Boll & Branch, started by Vanderbilt graduates Scott and Missy Tannen. I've slept on Boll & Branch sheets for years. They are just amazing, comfortable sheets. They are fair trade certified. That means they've been made under safe conditions by men and women treated and paid fairly. Try them for a month. You've got a guarantee that you can return them anytime within that window, but you're not going to want to. Once you get the sheets, try the mattress. That was voted Best Mattress of 2018. Go to bollandbranch.com. That's spelled B-O-L-L. Enter the promo code Vandy. Get $50 off your first set of sheets. Chris Clark joins me. Chris works for Gamecock Central. That is the exclusive home for South Carolina on the Rivals.com network. Chris is one of my favorite guys at the network. Nice guy, knows his stuff. Chris, thank you for joining us today. How have you been?
It's my pleasure. I'm well. I hope you are, and I appreciate you having me.
Let's talk about the state of South Carolina football heading into this season. I know the schedule has been a main point of emphasis. It's brutal, maybe the toughest in the country, but there also seems to be an optimism that if Carolina can get through it, that it might be a top 25 level team.
Well, I mean, the thing about it, Chris, is so interesting this year is there's almost unanimous agreement that this is probably Will Muschamp's best team since he's been at South Carolina. Yet the schedule was so difficult that this may not be a team that reflects that in the final results from a wins-loss standpoint. And that's not really a slight at where the program's at. I mean, look, when a coach takes over a program where South Carolina wasn't struggling, and to be sure, I can tell you from covering it, things were not good from a recruiting standpoint. Things were not as good from a facility standpoint. Made some strides with that, but they needed to get better, and they're a lot better now with the operations building, the practice fields, indoor facility. They weren't good from a recruiting standpoint, facility standpoint, and they weren't good from a team standpoint, as in the roster wasn't exactly stocked with talent. And so Muschamp had a tall order when he arrived. It was a 3-win team. You know, they had major questions at many positions. They had major questions with depth. Probably at the bottom or maybe bottom 2 to 3 in the conference in terms of talent when you factored in inexperience plus talent on the roster. I mean, that's just where it is. I really believe that. And so he's had to build that up. I mean, first recruiting class, you get 2 months to build it. You get 2 months to build it at South Carolina without tradition, without the benefit of having had a strong season the year before. They're coming off a 3-win season. Georgia, Clemson, all those programs are really beginning to do well or have been doing well in the past. So it was a tall order. And so, you look at building towards that year 4, Mark Stoops, surely was waiting on his team that he just had in Kentucky that was good last year for several years as well and got it built up. And now they have to try to sustain it or build on it. And, Muschamp finally has the type of offense that he wants to run. He made the change from Kurt Roper to Brian McClendon because, contrary to to popular belief, Muschamp wanted to run a more wide open, up tempo offense that took more shots, played in more tempo. He wanted that. And so we got more of a taste of that last year. Definitely some inconsistencies, but you saw some glimpses of it with what they were able to do at times. I mean, you look at the Clemson game, scoring 35 points against that defense was certainly one of them. They were really hit hard by injuries last year. Safety, they were down 6 safeties at one point that they were counting on from the preseason until they got to a point later in the season where they had 2 available safeties. Both those guys were playing banged up. So they were really hit at defensive line, defensive end in particular, and at safety. And so they've had some time to build up some more depth. They feel like they're more competitive up front in terms of depth. They're still thin at some spots in the secondary. They got some questions. I mean, the run game has got to get a lot better. And I don't know if the answer is there this season to get markedly better. But they got a veteran quarterback. They've recruited pretty well on the lines of scrimmage. It's going to be a difficult slate. I mean, there aren't many games that you can point to on the roster and say that's a win. There are a lot of could wins. There are some should wins. But there are a lot of them that you just don't know, Alabama, Georgia, Clemson, Texas A&M. Those are the kind of games that are just so difficult for any team. Anybody in the country playing this schedule, you go, man, that's going to be a really tough out.
Yeah, and if our listeners have not seen the schedule, it's got North Carolina to open, it's got Clemson to close, it's got a game with Appalachian State right after the Vanderbilt game. The ASU game is on November the 9th. It's got Alabama in it. It's got, of course, everybody in the East. It's got a road trip to Texas A&M. Vanderbilt fans have complained some about having to play Purdue. The thought is, well, you've got to play a Power 5 game. Why pick Purdue? Because they're on the rise. Jeff Brom's done some good things. Everybody knows about that Ohio State game. And I kind of shake my head and laugh and say, well, that game was scheduled years ago. I know that Clemson is always a fixture on the schedule, but you look at that, North Carolina's on there, Appalachian State, it's no mystery what those guys can do since beating Michigan a dozen years ago, whatever that's been now. How did this thing get put together like this?
Well, I think one thing is, a few different aspects to it, not just one. So like you said, Chris, I mean, the schedule gets put together years in advance. And the one thing that I feel pretty confident in saying about future schedules, unless you can never tell so many years out, who's going to be at the coach's school or if they're going to be good or not. There are some schools that you can think they probably will or won't, right? But you're not totally sure. You don't know if a school that you schedule that right now runs, say, the air raid is going to be running the triple option. If South Carolina, I can tell you right now, there's not going to be any team in the future that runs the option that South Carolina will play in the future, unless there's just no other option. But it's difficult to schedule, right? I mean, athletic directors are having a tough time finding games because the guarantee money that you have to pay is a lot. It's tough to find open games. I mean, it's a difficult thing to do. And so, I don't know the ins and outs. I can't even recall exactly when the App State game got finalized and put on the roster. But so you look at a team like Appalachian State, they're always going to be good, right? I mean, they have been historically when they were at FCS. They moved to the Sun Belt, whether it was Coach Moore there, Coach Satterfield, now it's Eli Drinkwitz. They still have talent on that roster. Got a veteran quarterback. Darrington Evans, a really good skill position player. I mean, they're going to be a good team for that level, especially, and they're fully capable of coming in and knocking off South Carolina or a bunch of other teams. So I don't know the particulars of that, to be quite honest with you, of why that game got scheduled. But again, you probably go back to it's tougher to get games. It's tough to get games. North Carolina is a team that South Carolina has played before. They played them. You think of 2015, the 3-win season for South Carolina. They opened the season with North Carolina and actually squeaked out a win over a good Tar Heel team that year. So that's, part of that, just playing another game sort of in that series. And it's a Charlotte game. South Carolina has they recruit the Charlotte area. They're making North Carolina. It's always going to be a state of emphasis sort of in their 5-hour geographic radius that they're really going to try to concentrate on. And so that's a game they don't mind playing. They're good with that. But the rest of it, I mean, look, some of it you just chalk up to, as far as Clemson in the out of conference. I mean, South Carolina, so they're going to play Clemson every year. That's the rival. It's always at the end of the year. That's what they do. Clemson just happens to be really, really good right now. And then, you look at the conference slate. South Carolina gets stuck with Texas A&M as the permanent opponent. That's never an easy deal. They've become a team that's had talent year after year. South Carolina's been close to beating them, but has not done it since they joined the SEC. And now they got Jimbo Fisher and trying to revitalize that program and stocking it with talent again. So it's going to be a tough matchup every year. Other teams in the league are generally trying to improve and get better. Georgia is rolling. And then this is the year that Alabama comes on your schedule, just rotates on. So, and Alabama's Alabama. So it's really just sort of a perfect storm of factors, I think, that contributed to getting this schedule. And there's no doubt it's a very, very difficult one. And I maintain that, that there are a handful of programs in the country that would have, I think, a decent shot at getting through this schedule unscathed. And I don't know if there's more than maybe one or two of them, if that.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody in the country gets through that schedule unscathed.
Yeah, I mean, you look at, I think the three of the teams on the schedule would have a chance. And I think it'd be Alabama, Georgia, and Clemson would maybe have the best shot to do it. Now all of those teams could easily drop at least one game on the schedule. But, if you're going to go through the schedule and sort of cherry pick, hey, who could get through this schedule? Who would have the best shot? I mean, that's the three I would pick. If I had to bet a bunch of money on any one of them getting through it without a single loss, I don't know if I could do that, especially if you factored in, going and having to play a conference title game at the end of the year. Say you're Bama, say Alabama, let's take away the divisions, and this is just the schedule you play. Say that they play Georgia during the regular season, they play Clemson, they play, A&M, for everybody. They get through it unscathed, then they got to go play, presumably, let's just say you're taking the top two teams from the conference instead of divisional. Say you go play Alabama and Georgia again in the conference title game, so then you got to play the best team in your conference aside from you twice. So, I mean, it would be incredibly difficult in that hypothetical scenario.
Yeah, it's nuts. I look at it and I feel like somebody left LSU off the schedule by mistake.
Yeah, just throw them in for good measure. I mean, probably a night game at Tiger Stadium, just for Death Valley. Just throw that one on there for good measure. Yeah, you're right. Probably just left it off.
Exactly. Well, let's go back to a few years ago, because I very distinctly remember being at media days and Steve Spurrier was talking about how they had it rolling. And I think that was the year they went 6-6 or whatever and were just very mediocre. Will Muschamp, as any coach does, you always inherit what the coach did before you. Where did it go wrong for Steve Spurrier at the end of his career?
Oh, man, you asked a loaded question there. I think so many different things. And Steve Spurrier himself on 107.5 The Game, which is the flagship station around here in Columbia, went on with Heath Klein recently, and he had some interesting comments actually about all that. And since Spurrier left, I've spent a lot of time talking to, former players, former people around the program, trying to get a gauge on that myself. A lot of it I could see covering the program. You can see the obvious things like, hey, recruiting slipped. They're not as talented, as they were. But I think it was just so many different factors. But one that Spurrier sort of alluded to, and other people, was really the attitude of the team was one thing, which, sort of sounds interesting. But, Spurrier mentioned complacency. He said that they had a bad attitude on the team. I mean, he took blame, so you blame the head coach for those things. But, I go back to, in college football, if you're good, you're talented. If you're not good, you're probably not talented, or you have some talent, but you got the wrong kind of guys. You're not coaching them well. You're not putting them in good spots. But you got to have talent to be good. Go look at every single team that's been successful. The common denominator is they're all really good. They have a bunch of big, fast, strong, skilled guys who are good at football. That's what it comes down to. And Spurrier's best teams had a lot of those guys. Jadeveon Clowney, Marcus Lattimore, had guys like Connor Shaw, who were tough as nails and were really good football players. They just had a ton of them. Alshon Jeffrey Gilmore, the list goes on and on. And so I think one of the biggest things was the talent just slipped. You went from landing guys like, even going back to like Cliff Matthews and, then Gilmore, Devontae Holloman, Lattimore, Jeffrey, Clowney, Melvin Ingram, all these types of guys who were, a lot of those names I'm talking about were on the same teams, and a lot of them were playing in the NFL. And South Carolina went 33-6 over a 3-year period. And you would look at the recruiting classes, and it didn't seem like they were bringing in the same guys, the same type of guy. They didn't really reload. I talked to some of the players who were on the 2014 team, and then the 2015 team who had slipped to, 7 wins and then 3 wins respectively. And he said, we had a bunch of guys that came in with the attitudes, we're going to come in, we're going to play 3 years and leave. We're going to be as good as these other guys. And they're pretty frank about it. He said, we just weren't as good. I think some bad evaluations in recruiting, missing in recruiting. I think they fell behind the times in recruiting a lot. When other schools were, doing things like creating graphic departments. Now everybody has one, right? I mean, everybody's done that now. Even tiny schools have people designing graphics and stuff, but just stuff like that they didn't pay attention to. They didn't seem to have as much of a plan for recruiting. Spurrier was never super involved in recruiting, but at their height, at their biggest run, he had guys who were really strong recruiters on his staff who had a plan, and they were bringing in a lot of players. And certainly it helped that they had a run of really, really good in-state talent, and they did a good job of keeping that talent at home too. So I think it was just a lot of factors, and then those things, honestly, they just sort of fell off. There were some staff changes. Spurrier went back in that same interview I was referencing. He said, hey, I should have let a couple guys go. I made some staff decisions that didn't work out for anything. And it just went south from there. And, I remember talking to a former walk-on from the program, because you remember Spurrier, hung it up basically midway through the season after the LSU game in 2015. He said, nobody really saw it coming, but, as far as him announcing that, but he said, you could see Spurrier was a guy that was always just so in control, always seemed to have an answer. And he said, you could see on the sideline that season that for the first time, he just seemed like he maybe wasn't in control, that maybe he just didn't have it together. And so I thought that was pretty telling.
Chris, let's talk about the Gamecocks on offense. Of course, you got Jake Bentley. I wanted to get into some questions on him lately or later in the podcast. Looks like the receiving core potentially is strength. I know Samuel's gone, but Brian Edwards is a good player. Shi Smith is a good player. The running game seems to be the perennial question for Carolina. They haven't really been great at that in a while. How do you see this offense this year?
There are some signs that make you think that could be a pretty good offense, and then some that are still worrisome, to be honest. Up front, they lost a couple guys, but I think up front, they're still going to be pretty good. I think they've got some veterans and they've got some young players to where I think they can patch it together to have a pretty good offensive line. They moved Sadarius Hutcherson to left tackle. They moved Donnell Stanley to guard from center. So they'll be breaking in a new center. They'll be breaking in a new right guard. But Dylan Wanham played very well as a true freshman at right tackle last year. You feel like they'll have a pretty good group if they can stay healthy. Jake Bentley's experienced. They have experience at a lot of spots, including Brian Edwards and Shi Smith. Debo, I think, is a huge question not having him. Small sample, but when he wasn't on the field late last year, this team really struggled. They struggled the second half of the Akron game, and they looked terrible against Virginia. Now, nobody particularly played well against Virginia on the entire team. So I don't know that you make that as an indictment against the offense. But it is a question because Debo was such an electric player, could do so many different things that, you just wonder how they're going to adjust. So Shi Smith's emergence is huge. He's going to be taking on a bigger role. Then they need a Josh Vann or a Dreek Davis or a freshman or somebody to step up at receiver. And you're right, the running game is something where when they played good defenses last season, and really all 3 years of Muschamp, and he talks about this a lot, but they haven't been able to run the ball against good teams. And if you can't do that, it becomes very hard. And that's been the biggest difference. That's the biggest, the defense last year really struggled. And a lot of that had to do with injuries. But, a running game for this team that was good would make a huge difference. It's just been average or below average. Call it like it is. And so, Rico Dowdle, if he can be healthy, stay healthy, which he has not so far in his career, is a good, productive player. They're in position to potentially add Tavian Feaster, the graduate transfer running back from Clemson. If they could do that, that would help them. I don't know that there's an overnight fix that's going to take this run game from average to excellent in one season, but they can be better. And so a lot of the offseason, preseason camp has been devoted to trying to solve that. But, honestly, until further notice, you can definitely count it as a question mark.
Chris, Jake Bentley has been interesting to watch in terms of how his career has unfolded. I know that he came in as a freshman, did some really good things. I think at the time you're thinking this is going to be one of the greatest players maybe in the history of that program. And I think he may have even been 17 when he started playing. I'll let you correct me on that if you need to. But it seems like the shine has worn off his star a little bit from afar. I know the knock on him is he's 1-10 against ranked teams. How do you assess him going into his senior year?
I think Bentley has been a divisive figure, not for anything he's been a model citizen, and it was huge to get him to this program. I mean, remember coming in his freshman year, and he helped that team turn its fortunes around, get to a bowl game, and certainly done some good things during his career. You look at how some of his numbers stack up, have been very good, even compared to some really good quarterbacks. I think it's the stat that you mentioned, Chris, that really has people down on him. That's what's given people ammunition, I guess, against Bentley. But it's just, I think context is important, and it's something we don't really do well in college football. College football fans, context is not something that's done real well. It's just win and do it now or else. Doesn't matter. But, you look like, for instance, last season, South Carolina's defense. If they're full strength against Clemson, which they weren't anywhere close defensively, Clemson probably still wins that game, right? But South Carolina also scored 35 points, did the best job by a large margin of any other team that Clemson played that year offensively, and did some good things. They just had absolutely no answer defensively. They're completely depleted. One of South Carolina's defensive linemen played 100 snaps in that game, 100, and every special team, and had the flu the week before. So it's like they just had no depth whatsoever. And with that high-powered Clemson offense, it's tough. So I think what has driven the narrative about Bentley is that fact, the lack of a top 25 win, which to me, that's a team stat. Everybody looks at the quarterback, but it is still a team stat. And I think they look at that, and I think they look at some of the inconsistencies. I think they look at some of the games that he's had, whether it's against really good competition or if it's just sort of some games. The game that he had the year before last against Florida, where he threw multiple interceptions, didn't have a very good game. I think people look at those things. At the same time, you can look at it and go, you can mention what I did. The Gamecocks defense, the complete, I won't say complete lack, but a running game that has been average to below average, that, tends to hurt a quarterback's performance. So I think there's a lot of different things. I think Jake Bentley's been a huge positive to the program to have around. I think it's big to have him back this year for his senior season. Now, that said, certainly there's some things they want him to get better at. They've worked a lot on ball security, taking better care of the football, making better decisions. He can make all the throws. He's shown that. But it's just about the decision making. He can give you a lot from an improvisational standpoint, but when he improvises, made good decisions. And that's the biggest thing. If he can do that, and South Carolina can find a semblance of a running game, I think they'll have a chance to be successful, at least offensively.
I think it's a good thing you're on this podcast and there's a Vanderbilt audience, because I think when you use the word context, there's like at least a half dozen fan bases that would not know what that word means.
That's all, just a half a dozen, huh?
Well, I was being generous.
It is. I mean, I think people understand. I mean, a lot of times when you bring up stuff like that, people say, it's an excuse, whatever. But I think you just have to be realistic at times. I mean, when, for me covering South Carolina, I think people look at it and they say this team can be successful because, look at the 2010 through 2013 years, very successful, beat Clemson every year. Should have made it to Atlanta probably at least once or twice more, but didn't. Made it there once for first time in school history and won 33 games in 3 years from 2011 to 13. And I say, yes, that's absolutely true. Now, circumstances are a little different. Georgia's is probably even better than they were. Clemson is markedly better than they were. They were good at that time, but they're markedly better. And South Carolina, to take the next step that they need to as a program, they've got to beat Clemson and Georgia and Alabama and those types on recruits. And that's tough to do right now. They've got to do it with, they got nice facilities and they've got coaches that have pedigrees, whether it's college or the NFL, but they have to do it with a trophy case that's pretty bare. They don't have conference titles to speak of. They don't have national titles. So I think when I say context, you just point out the difficulties of the job, sort of some of the realities of the job. That doesn't mean nobody should ever expect to win or that it won't ever happen. It just means it's a slower build. And, when Will Muschamp took this job, and this would have been the case for probably almost any coach that would have taken that job. I mean, just take away the constraints and say anybody takes that job. This was a longer rebuild. When Muschamp got the job, people asked, well, how long, will it maybe take to get back on track if it's going to happen? And my answer was, I think 6 or 7 years. And I don't think just because they win 9 in year 2, you then go back and change that and say, okay, it's time to take it to, Mach 10. Yeah, I think it's still a slow build no matter what. Now, what'll happen in year 6 or 7 or 8, or will there be those years? I can't say for sure. I just think you got to point out that the job when he took it was exceedingly difficult. And I think it remains that way.
Let's talk defense for a minute. Carolina's really got some dudes on the front seven, including Javon Kinlaw, who just wrecked Vanderbilt a year ago. That seems like that's the foundation for where they're going to build their success this year.
I think that's the reason that people are higher on the defense this year. Certainly I am, and that's provided they can stay healthy. I mean, nobody foresaw all the injuries that just piled up last season. I mean, it was ridiculous, really. And if they can avoid that, and I think they will have a chance to be pretty good again, the schedule, they're going to play some really good offensive teams this year. And so they're going to play some offenses that will make really good defenses look bad at times. But I think it's certainly a stronger group, a better outlook, more competitive depth up front. They have, when everybody's healthy, 2 or 3 deep up front. When I say 2 or 3 deep, that doesn't mean there's absolutely no drop off. They're just absolutely loaded with studs all over the place. Just mean that they've got some guys where if you roll in a second or third team, it's not a guy who's never played. It's not a walk-on. They've got some guys who can play football, who have played. Kinlaw certainly one. Kier Thomas has played a lot of ball. Kobe Smith, a senior, has played a lot of ball. They've got some guys like Jabari Ellis, Brad Johnson, who are juniors who have taken steps forward. Zach Pickens is a 5-star freshman who's going to factor in. Joseph Anderson, a 4-star out of Tennessee. So, they've got more competitive depth, including some guys that I haven't even mentioned because they sort of just get lost sometime. DJ Moore, is a senior who is one of their team captains and one of the best players on the team, missed, most of the season last year. So that is, the reason for a heightened outlook for this team is that they're just better up front. J.C. Horn and Israel Mukwamu at corner, they feel good about those guys. They lost Jalen Dickerson, who was going to be a 2-deep guy at safety already with just sort of a weird sort of freak surgery he's got to have. But they feel like at safety, they've got a couple guys. Then at linebacker, T.J. Brunson's back. He'll be a senior. Sherrod Green, they feel like it's become more consistent. They got Eldridge Thompson back for a 6th year. And they feel like some of the younger guys are coming along. So I do think it's a group that can certainly be better provided they stay healthy. And a lot of that starts up front.
Our mailbag is sponsored by Vanderbilt fan and independent insurance agent Josh Minton of Brentwood. You need an insurance agent who wants to know your unique needs and circumstances and will tailor an insurance plan to fit them. Josh is your guy. Call him 615-933-1979. Email him at josh@hqinsurance.com. Follow him on Facebook at facebook.com/JD Minton HQ. He's my agent. Give him a shot. I think you'll be pleased. Ann Arbor asks, how strong is the support for Will Muschamp between the administration and the fan base?
All right, so I'll split that up into two instead of lumping them in together. I think the administration support is very high. I think it's really good, both from what they think he's doing, how they view his work, and just the monetary and time support and all those different things, the resources that they're giving them. When you look at support as far as what kind of facilities and all those things are you given? They just opened a $50 million operations center. That's a pretty big investment. That's a strong measure of support for any coach. And that's helped, I think. But just internally, the way he's viewed, everybody that Muschamp has worked for has raved about him. Guys remember when he was let go at Florida, it was like his press conference that day was almost bizarre with Jeremy Foley and the president of Florida. It was like a family reunion or something. They're saying all these nice things, and it just didn't work there. And he's viewed that way at South Carolina. Everybody really likes him, and I think the administration understands the road that he has to hoe. It's a difficult one, and I think they've been encouraged with a lot of the things. The fan base. My general answer for stuff like this, and maybe I shouldn't generalize it, is you could pick any topic and there's going to be a divide in the fan base over it. Some people never supported the Will Muschamp hire and probably never will unless he won a championship, multiple championships, maybe not even then. Some people supported it. Maybe they've changed, maybe they haven't. I think after the second year, there was a lot of support, because people saw, my goodness, we've gone from 3 wins to 6 to 9. We got to start beating Clemson and Georgia at least sometime. But, they saw the progress. Last year was a little bit of a step back because although they're more competitive against Clemson, still no big wins. The top 25 wins weren't there. And then the Belk Bowl against Virginia was a disaster, which everybody's admitted. So I think that's taken some things back. But, I think it's just a split, but I think certainly there's still a good bit of fan support, and I think that'll bear itself out this season because there'll be a lot of people at the games. There's some big games this season inside Williams-Brice.
Vandy Stud asks, how do you compare this year's team to last?
I'll go back to what I said at the beginning of the podcast. I think it's a better team, probably. But I don't know how many more wins that equates to with this schedule. The schedule is going to be hard every single year. They're going to play Clemson every year. They're going to play Georgia. Probably for the foreseeable future, those teams are going to be good. The other ones are trying to get better, at least in the SEC. It's going to be a tough road every year. But this one's just very, very difficult. So I think the defense, again, as long as they're healthy, the defense is probably markedly better from what we saw, especially at the end of the year when it's sort of a mass unit. The offense is I have some more questions. I think the running game will be better if they're healthy. I think they'll make some explosive plays in the receiving game, but I do have serious questions because of Deebo Samuel and how good he was. They've got to make the adjustment there. So I think it's a better football team overall, but it's hard to tell if that will bear itself out in the schedule.
Chris, last question for the fans, and I'm going to follow up with one of my own coming out of this, and then I'm going to let you go. Foghorn wants to know, how has Clemson's recent dominance impacted the Gamecocks' in-state recruiting?
Well, I think Clemson's dominance has almost affected Clemson's in-state recruiting a little bit more. And what I mean by that is Clemson is being very choosy in the state. They're being very choosy a lot of places, just to be honest with you, but being a little bit more choosy in the state. South Carolina, with guys that they've wanted from the state, have done pretty well with them. But there haven't been a lot of head-to-head competitions between South Carolina and Clemson. You look at last year's class, and, South Carolina took Xavier Legette out of Mullins. He was a guy that was sort of lightly recruited. I mean, Tennessee offered, Clemson did not. You look at Cam Smith. He was a 4-star guy, but Clemson didn't offer him. South Carolina beat, Georgia, Tennessee, some others on him. Zach Pickens was a big recruiting win because he's from Anderson. Clemson definitely wanted him. Anderson's about 15, 20 minutes from Clemson. They beat Clemson and Georgia on him, so that was significant for them. Then, Keyshawn Toney was another guy from the state of South Carolina that Clemson didn't offer. Clemson took Michael Dukes, a running back out of Charleston, that South Carolina did not push for at the end. So I think there hadn't been a ton of in-state carryover. The guys that South Carolina has recruited from within the state, they've offered and pushed for, they've done pretty well the past few years under Muschamp at landing those guys, but it's hard to get a direct correlation because, Clemson's been a little bit more choosy on some in-state guys, and there haven't been a ton of head-to-heads on those in-state guys.
Chris, you see this with Auburn. Alabama has just dominated, and that has put a lot more pressure on every coach there to an extent to where the expectations are completely unrealistic. I don't sense that it's been quite the same at South Carolina with what Clemson has done, but I have to think that has been tough for whoever's been in that coaching chair, which has been Will Muschamp most of the time, to have to deal with that. I would think that does breed some sort of unfair expectation.
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, again, when Muschamp walked into the job, he did so in an era in which the memory of South Carolina beating Clemson 5 in a row, making it to Atlanta, winning 33 games in a year, and being very competitive year in and year out for a span of 4 seasons was still very fresh. That was still very fresh. So people now had that to point to say this can be done in Columbia. When Muschamp took over, Clemson was a lot better. Again, they were good when South Carolina was beaten. That was a good football team from that 2000, 2009 up to 2013. I mean, those are good teams that South Carolina was beating. But they took another step, obviously, as we've seen over the past few seasons. And so they were even better. Georgia was, starting to really recruit lights out and get a lot better. So your two, biggest rivals really are rolling, when you're taking the job. And so, yeah, it creates some expectations that are probably unfair, because what's the coach at South Carolina? Really anywhere. I mean, you're supposed to beat your rival. You're supposed to be competitive in the conference. And so for South Carolina, for Muschamp or anyone taking the job, it's a tough ask. But people still expect to do it. I mean, it's a results business. I mean, you've got to start doing it at some point. So I do think people aren't completely unrealistic and they think, okay, South Carolina, they need to, it's not like you're at Georgia where it's, okay, we need to win the East every year and we need to beat Georgia Tech every year. Those things are, at Georgia, honestly, I won't say it's easy, but those are things that you can point to and say that can be done, most of the time. At South Carolina, again, this is not Georgia. It's not Alabama. It's not a program that has that tradition. So I think people have to realize that South Carolina's program from a historical perspective is not that. But I do think fans, and this is justifiable, I think it's completely fair to feel this way. They just want to be competitive, and they want to be in the mix to go to Atlanta on a semi-regular basis, and they want to beat Clemson more often than not. And that's fair. I think you just have to recognize what it's going to take to get there.
Chris, thank you as always. You've been a frequent guest on our podcast over the years. I want you to take a moment to tell people where they can find your site on Twitter and your handle on Twitter, and maybe anything at Gamecock Central coming up or in the recent past that might catch the interest of our listeners.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Chris. You can find me on Twitter at GC Chris Clark. And then visit GamecockCentral.com. New stuff every day, football, recruiting, cover the other major sports as well. But definitely with the season, with practice right around the corner, we're going to be hitting a lot of preseason stuff as that gets rolling in August. Recruiting stuff with the very short open period back here, but always recruiting stuff to talk about. So give us a look, check out some content, and we appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Thank you.
He's Chris Clark of Gamecock Central. I'm Chris Lee, the host of the Vandy Sports Podcast. Thanks for listening, and have a great weekend.